So the maritime strategy was the maritime and naval component. It wasn't the whole thing, but it was the naval component of the overall U.S. military strategy of the 1980s against the Soviet Union and its allies. It was a concept that was developed by the U.S. Navy to describe what the Navy's leadership thought was the best way at sea and from the sea to block and roll back Soviet global adventurism, to deter the Soviet Union from starting a war against the U.S. and its allies, and if deterrence were to fail, to best counter, combat, and defeat the Soviets. That's what it was. It described recommended U.S. and Allied operations during peacetime, in response to crises, and in conventional combat, and in the event of theater nuclear weapons being used. In discussing combat against the Soviet Union, it assumed that the Soviets had been the aggressor and were moving offensively in some manner against the United States and its treaty allies. To counter that Soviet offensive, it proposed a global, forward, offensive, joint, and allied maritime strategy with major campaigns in and from the Norwegian and Barents Seas, the Arctic Ocean, North Norway, the Baltic, Thrace, Turkish Straits, Eastern Mediterranean, and the Northwest Pacific, and across the North Atlantic and across the North Pacific. It foresaw possible campaigns as well in the Caribbean, the South Atlantic, the Indian Ocean, and the South China Seas, where the Soviet Navy had a presence. It assumed the war would be global, and as a baseline, it assumed that all U.S. treaty allies, including Japan, would become involved. It sought to create, maintain, and if possible, enlarge the Western alliance system, to include, if possible, China. Remember, this is the China of the 1980s we're talking. It represented a China that was very hostile to the Soviet Union, but looking back at it, was becoming decreasingly so over the decade. It represented the Navy, and this is a very important point. This was the Navy's considered strategic viewpoint as professionals. But it was understood throughout the U.S. government, including in the Navy, that the decisions to do any of this lay with the President and the Secretary of Defense, not the Navy. So it's a Western democracy, civilian control of the military, that was understood. But the Navy's view, still the Navy's view today, is if the President asks you, well, what do you recommend, or what are my options, the Navy shouldn't be in a position of saying, well, we don't know, or we hadn't thought of that because we never thought you'd ask, or whatever. So this represented the Navy's advice, if you will. So how did it happen? How did it emerge? First of all, it embodied certain fundamental basic characteristics of the U.S. Navy, a Navy which is different and has had a different history from other navies, that had existed since its birth in the days of John Paul Jones and the American Revolution, and had been codified in the writings more than a century later by Admiral Alfred Thayer Mahan and other naval writers. What were these characteristics? Powerful ships, far forward operations, seeking to carry the fight to the enemy, global campaigns, coordination with and support of the other U.S. services and America's allies. And you have to remember, this was devised in the face of a massive Soviet naval buildup: submarines, warships, aircraft, missiles, satellites, and worldwide Soviet Navy deployments that took place during the 1960s and 70s and 80s following the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. It was also developed, the maritime strategy was also developed in part in reaction to the American Carter administration's defense policies from 1977 through 1981, which saw the U.S. Navy useful principally to escort convoys of supplies across the Atlantic for the U.S. Army and Air Force in Germany. They didn't see an important or useful role for the Navy's carrier or amphibious or submarine fleet, and accordingly they reduced funding for those forces. The U.S. Navy during this period thought it had a much better idea. It developed that idea in a planning document called Sea Plan 2000, in a concept of forward operations developed by Admiral Tom Hayward, who was the Pacific Fleet commander in the late 70s. It was called Sea Strike, and in a series of annual global war games at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, and in some other ways. this is important. So well, watch the chart. So the U.S. Navy also achieved in the late 1970s a much better understanding of how the Soviets thought about naval combat operations at sea and what their priorities were. I should just add parenthetically, there's almost nothing written about that. There's a reason for that. It's all still classified. But there's a book by our colleagues, David Rosenberg and Chris Ford, called The Admiral's Advantage. And if you're interested, that's about as close as you can get to how the U.S. naval intelligence and what was involved in that at the time. But chief among the priorities, as we understood them, of the Soviets regarding naval combat operations at sea was the deployment and protection of their strategic nuclear ballistic missile submarine fleet, which they were increasingly emplacing in what we called their bastions in the Barents Sea and the Sea of Okhotsk. Secondary priorities were protection of the Soviet homeland from attack from the sea, and to support the Soviet armies as they swarmed into Western Europe, Norway, Turkey, Hokkaido, and perhaps China. A lesser priority for the Soviets was the interdiction of supply ships trundling across the Atlantic and Pacific. 1978, Admiral Hayward left the Pacific Fleet and became the Chief of Naval Operations, the head of the U.S. Navy. And he came to Washington and he expanded the forward offensive concepts he'd developed in the Pacific to the entire globe. These concepts involved the early forward use against the Soviets of carrier battle groups, amphibious forces with Marines, attack submarines, and other U.S. and allied naval forces. 2 years later, Ronald Reagan won election as President of the United States, defeating President Carter. Reagan was a believer in the Navy's concepts, and he appointed an aggressive and thoughtful Republican naval strategist, Dr. John F. Lehman, Jr., as civilian Secretary of the Navy. He also increased the Navy's budget considerably. So then what happened? Well, the result in 1981 and 1982, as Michi has just related to you, was the conceptualizing, the drafting, and the promulgation by the Navy of the Maritime Strategy, which was a secret document with an unclassified version not publicly presented until January 1986. Meanwhile, the Navy moved forward to implement the strategy that it was writing, practicing it in forward joint and allied exercises off the Soviet coasts, developing new operational concepts and tactics to carry it out, expanding its wargaming program, coordinating with the other U.S. services and allied navies, including the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force, and practicing these new tactics at sea and in advanced training institutions like Top Gun and Strike U. I should also say that some of us delved into our naval history back in those days, looking back at naval history, to see just how other Navy planners had gone about their business and what they had done. And we had the extreme good fortune at the time that our colleague Ed Miller was writing a book, struggling to get through it, which was perfect for our purposes regarding learning how to plan and how to write these things. He wrote the book, War Plan Orange, about a different time and a different enemy, a book which is in naval writing today a classic, and in my world, the classic. The U.S. Navy also reached out to China, visiting Chinese ports for the first time since the Communist Revolution there, and allowing the sale to China of useful American military equipment like torpedoes, helicopters, destroyer engines. They're still in service in the Chinese Navy, and they're, of course, solid American technology. A key aspect of the strategy was going after the Soviet nuclear strategic reserve in the bastions. They're knowing that we would do this, and that we could do this, and we probably would do that, we believed would contribute to deterring them from starting a war. Just as we believed that demonstrating an early offensive posture off Hokkaido, in the Sea of Japan, in the fjords of Norway, and among the islands of the Aegean Sea, and under the Arctic ice cap, would reinforce the deterrent effect of U.S. and allied naval forces. So that was us. What role did we see Japan play? Well, first of all, to defend its own air, land, and water space, including the straits between the islands. This obviously would block the Soviet fleet from coming out. That would suit Japan's purposes, and it would also suit our purposes. So the alliance was tight that way. Protecting the Pacific sea lines of communications out to 1,000 nautical miles. This was the policy change or shift or development during the Suzuki and then Nakasone periods. Continued support we hoped we would get for U.S. forces in Japan. And we saw Japan as being a country that was able to develop and to absorb and to use effectively anti-air, anti-submarine, anti-surface, and mine warfare capabilities as sophisticated as our own. Finally, we hoped that the Japanese would coordinate with us and cooperate with us and with our South Korean allies. These roles, incidentally, all complemented and supplemented the roles of other U.S. allies in the Pacific, in NATO, and in South America. This is a very compelling case I've just made. Not everybody agreed with this. There were several criticisms that were aimed at the maritime strategy. I can still show you some of the scar tissue. Some came from within the Navy itself, and some came from academics, some academics, not all. Former Carter administration officials, so-called military reformers who were active at the time, like Senator Gary Hart, and others. And of course, there were several criticisms from the Soviets. So what were these criticisms? Well, some thought that you just couldn't do it. Soviets were going to be too hard. You couldn't do what we said we were going to try to do with naval forces. Some thought that it was dangerously escalatory, while the Navy believed that by making sure that the Soviets knew that their strategic reserve would be in jeopardy, and therefore that would enhance deterrence. There were several academics, colleagues, friends of mine, John Mearsheimer, Barry Posen, who argued that on the contrary, by doing that you're destabilizing things. This fit in, of course, in our view, with the Soviet line, which was everything that we ever did was destabilizing, and so there were several debates during this period. Some thought that the Allies couldn't be depended on. One of those allies would have been Japan. And so there were discussions about that. Some thought that the Soviet priorities wouldn't be what we said they were. British thought that convoys were an answer, and that cutting the sea lines of communication was really central to the Soviet concept of operations. We thought it was not. Some thought that we wouldn't make much difference to the Soviets anyway. Even if we got through and did all of these things, the main event was going to be in Central Europe, and since we weren't directly involved in that, that was... Gary Hart thought we just had the wrong Navy for it. We thought that the concept was sound, but we were building exactly the wrong things to carry it out. The Army disliked it because it was taking money away from the Army in their view. So, and then there were others that simply said it was too expensive. So there was a lot of criticism, and the Navy worked hard to understand these criticisms and to incorporate parts of them in the strategy itself and to counter them as necessary. Reagan administration remained supportive, and the strategy endured after Secretary Lehman and Admiral Hayward had left Washington, and indeed until the Warsaw Pact collapsed in 1990. Meanwhile, the Soviets sought to counter the strategy by continuing their extensive building program. It was extraordinary. They were still throwing destroyers and frigates and cruisers into the water in 1990, as you know, Poland and Czech Republic and East Germany were all fading. And that was something that the Navy had to take into account, the U.S. Navy and the Japanese Navy, self-defense force. The Soviets also staged their own games and exercises, interfered with ours, and spied on us. They were assisted in all of this by a few American citizens whom they paid for information, including members of the U.S. Navy itself, in jobs that gave them access to critical information, especially how vulnerable Soviet submarines had become, which was a problem the Soviets strove to fix with some success. This was the Walker Brothers family, and there were others. Soviets were also unfortunately aided by a few Western companies, like Kongsberg and Toshiba, who sold the Soviets vital advanced submarine technology when they knew they shouldn't have. Most importantly, The Soviets unleashed a major diplomatic offensive calling for naval arms control agreements to constrain both navies, but which would have had the actual effect of constraining only the U.S. Navy and lessening its ability to come to the assistance of exposed allies like Norway, Greece, Turkey, South Korea, and Japan, as well as potentially friendly neutrals like China. Fortunately, in our view, none of this works. The U.S. government hung tough against naval arms control measures, which they clearly understood would only hamper one side. Allied governments and the navies worked increasingly closely with the United States and its Navy, as did the U.S. Marine Corps, Coast Guard, and Air Force. So then what happened? Well, you know what happened. After the Soviet pact collapsed came the demise of the Soviet Union itself and the end of its colossal naval building program and global operations. The U.S. Navy, accordingly, developed a new concept called From the Sea for dealing with the immediate post-Cold War world. And as the post-Cold War world has evolved, so has U.S. Navy thinking. The Navy's current strategy is a thing called a Cooperative Strategy for 21st Century Sea Power. This is also available online in hard copy, even though it's contemporary because it's unclassified. It was published just a year ago this month. Our alliances have endured and even expanded. Our strong naval alliance with Japan has, of course, continued and is often front-page news today. As you, of course, all know, it's part of the reason why you're here. But my time is up. So I look forward to your comments and questions. Turn things back over to my colleagues.
Okay, I guess we have a slide. Okay, I think we're. No, I think the first slide is should be the Navasota. There you go. There we go. All right. Yeah, save the best for last there. Okay. Hello. Thanks again for everybody for coming. Thank you, Peter, and for. I'm showing a picture of the USNS Navasota. I guess it's about. 32 years ago, I was the officer in charge of the military detachments on board, and Peter was talking about the maritime strategy with forward presence. Well, 32 years ago, I was off the coast of Vladivostok, and thanks, Peter, for sending me to Siberia in November, December. Couldn't come up with a maritime strategy for Tahiti, could you? Okay. Anyway, during my frequent trips north of Vladivostok, we had frequent encounters with the Soviet naval vessels, and actually I was very impressed with the civility and professionalism with our Soviet counterparts. We had developed a signal system through the Incidents at Sea Agreement, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that a little later. I was asked, I want to take a look a little bit more macro as far as our strategies during the Cold War, and I want to talk about the obvious. And I was reminded, at the end of the war, we had Japan, and how we handled Japan really set the stages for everything else that would follow. Okay, the good news was, unlike Germany, with the exception of Northern Islands, Japan's territorial integrity remained intact. Now, getting back to the Navasota, I remember one time, now this is a military sea lift command, so I was a naval officer on mostly a civilian crew, and one of the crew members was a Navy sailor who had sailed into Sasebo right after World War II. So he was telling me about his experiences, and what he did is he had recalled going ashore and walking the streets of Sasebo and coming upon a couple of children who were playing outside, and him and his shipmate went to, say hello to the kids, and the mother came running outside the house. She was terrified. She was under the impression that these Americans, for some reason, were going to harm her children. And instead, this sailor and his shipmate pulled out a couple of Hershey bars. And that's kind of symbolic on how, the occupation of Japan, in contrast to what happened in World War I with Germany. We learned some lessons from Versailles, and that, if you can read William Manchester's American Caesar, how we brought Japan into the coalition of nations that would help to contain Soviet expansion is quite a remarkable story. The importance of Japan in the Western alliance becomes apparent early on when the North Korean advanced into South Korea in June 1950. It's the American Army occupation troops stationed in Japan are flown in to blunt the North Korean onslaught. While they proved merely to be a speed bump, they bought time for the defensive rim around Busan, and then it was, the counter invasion by MacArthur's brilliant counterstroke at Incheon that stabilized the situation on the Korean Peninsula. Now, it's interesting on those LSTs, some of them were manned by Japanese. Okay, the Korean War would go on for 3 years, but Japan's location was critical in that for maintaining South Korea the way it is as an ally today. Japan, as a willing partner in the Western Alliance, allowed us to forward deploy forces in the region to provide credibility to U.S. defense commitments. Thanks to an agreement signed in August 1972, besides ships such as Navasota, we have maintaining minesweeping and amphibious ships in Sasebo, a destroyer squadron and aircraft carrier in Yokosuka for several decades. Now do the math. To keep one ship forward deployed, you need to really have 3 ships in your inventory. To accommodate the transit and maintenance cycles. Currently, we have 20 ships home ported forward in Japan. That saves us from building and crewing 2 additional aircraft carriers, 2 additional command ships, 6 additional cruisers, 8 additional amphibious ships, 8 additional mine countermeasure ships, and a dozen additional destroyers to meet the mission. Now, what skewers that math a little bit is that these forward deployed ships do need some downtime for their own upkeep. Now, when I was embarked on board the Navasota, I remember the dedication and quality of the work done at the Sasebo shipyard. In fact, one time, I recall we were talking about some radio equipment, and this shipyard worker told me, "Well, I could get this done for you. Is it really important?" I said, "Well, I'd like to get it done. I have a wedding tomorrow. I can put it off." And I'm there like, it's not that important. Okay. Now, it's perhaps in retrospect that that worker was not too sure about that marriage, but I was just really impressed about the dedication of these and the quality of work they did. And I'll give you the case. Next slide, please. Should be the Midway. There you go. Okay. The aircraft carrier Midway. We stationed an aircraft in Japan in 1974 that was 28 years old. Okay, that carrier's sister ship, the Franklin D. Roosevelt, we were decommissioning and taking her out of service. But in the good care and hands of the Japanese in the shipyards up in Tokyo, our naval shipyard there, she was maintained in pristine condition and served out in the Western Pacific for the next 2 decades. Very important ship in our efforts in the Gulf Wars and Indian Ocean, forward presence. Thanks to the work that was done with her in Japan, she's now in San Diego. It's almost as a museum ship. It's a testimony to the good work that the Japanese performed on us. Now, the other thing is, of course, the importance of the Japan as part of our strategy in bringing the Japanese. Of course, the whole Cold War is about containing the Soviet Union and communism. Now, as far as containing communism in Asia, you got to take a look at the scorecard. Not too good here. You have, besides the Soviet Union, you had China, North Korea, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia over the course of the Cold War, came into the fall under the communist banner. It's the old bolt course for the Redskins would say not too good. But during the 1950s, communism was monolithic. We learned subsequently that communism was not monolithic. Dr. Kissinger accomplished through diplomacy what we failed in Southeast Asia, 11-year war, in Vietnam. We moved the containment of the Soviet Union up from Southeast Asia to the Manchurian border. During the 1980s, as Peter discussed, we actually had pretty warm relations, and we considered China as a strong ally versus the Soviet Union. That's the next slide, please. So as far as some of the challenges we had to do over the decades to execute this policy, for the United States to maintain a containment policy, it culminated was no easy matter. The United States is an island nation. I remember the frustrating my former boss at the Naval Historical Foundation, Admiral James Holloway III, he told me about this meeting he had with Secretary of Defense Harold Brown, who was in the Carter administration, doing this air of detente with the Soviet Union in the 1970s. And Brown argued that we needed to pursue stability with the Soviet Union by achieving parity in force structures. Now, to be credible, for our allies needed to know that the United States could maintain control of the high seas. The Soviet Navy, on the other hand, was a sea denial force. After his discussions with Secretary Brown, Holloway recalled his naval aide turning to him saying, "Admiral, for the upcoming football game between Army and Navy, our new slogan is Thai Army." And, in a war with the Soviet Union, Thai Soviet Navy was not an option. Let's go to the next slide. Okay. Going back to the 1950s, the Eisenhower administration implemented a new look that stressed overwhelming strategic nuclear forces. With this, the Air Force got a lion's share of the budget to build the B-47 B-52 bomber fleets, and then Atlas, Titan, Minuteman, ICBM bases. The Navy wanted to play in the Strategic Integrated Operations Plan as detailed in Vice Admiral Jerry Miller's book, Nuclear Weapons and Aircraft Carriers, How the Bomb Saved Naval Aviation. Eventually, we put nuclear weapons to sea in ballistic missile submarines. The Soviet Navy, which traditionally operated as ancillary support for the Red Army, took on the mission of defending the motherland from this nuclear threat. First with coastal forces, diesel boats, long-range aviation that could strike at aircraft carriers, and then a blue water nuclear subs and large combatants that could go after our SSBNs. Later, once the range of ballistic missiles increased, they created the bastion strategy for their strategic forces that Peter addressed in his talk. Given what was at stake, it was anticipated that a general war at sea with the Soviet Union could go nuclear fast, which I believe itself served as a deterrent to general war. Before the Navasota, I served on an ammunition ship, the USS Suribachi, and it had a slogan, "The next round's on us." When asked about the presence of nuclear weapons on our ship, our response was, "I can neither confirm nor deny the presence of nuclear weapons on board the USS Suribachi." One of the challenges operating with that capability in the Western Pacific was the sensitivities in Japan. Fortunately, I can neither confirm nor deny his response was satisfactory to the Japanese authorities, though clearly not satisfactory to many in the media and civilian population. Of course, with the development of Aegis and other precision conventional weapon systems in the 1980s, fighting a general war without nuclear weapons became feasible. Let's go to the final slide here. Regarding comparisons with the Cold War today, many have noted there are commonalities between the former Soviet Union and China today with regards to the growth of their respective naval forces. Both countries are continental powers, having a recent tradition of coastal forces. Decision of the Soviets to put naval forces to sea in the 1960s meant they had to fleet up young and inexperienced officers to command. It was following the collision of a Soviet destroyer with the HMS Ark Royal in November 1970 that the USSR approached the U.S. on safety at sea measures. Eventually, an incidents at sea agreement emerged in 1972 that significantly reduced the types of dangerous behaviors that had been ongoing: shoulderings, weapons pointings, low flight overpasses, bumpings, and other harassments. Now recognizing the emergence in the 1990s of the Chinese Blue Water Surface Force, there were calls for a U.S.-China Inc. Sea. However, Inc. Sea carried negative political connotations in that it was an accord signed between two hostile superpowers as a measure to avoid an accidental start of World War III. We did not want to confer hostile superpower status on China, a major trading partner with numerous cultural ties. Indeed, we have some 300,000 Chinese students studying right now in the United States. You didn't have that during the Cold War with the Soviet Union. So instead, the U.S. and China signed a military maritime consultative agreement in 1998, which facilitates the annual discussions of maritime issues. Initially, it lacked some of the provisions of the INCSEA regarding signals at sea and Navy communications. But over time, the two nations have adapted a code of unintended encounters at sea that was created by the Western Pacific Naval Symposium, an annual gathering of navies that operate in the region. A friend of mine, Captain Winton Smith, shared with me an encounter he had with a Chinese frigate while operating in the East China Sea a few years ago, and discussed the professionalism of his Chinese counterparts. Now, one thing I'm confident about is we really can't say for sure that even with the INCSEA Accord, one thing we can say for sure that even with the INCSEA Accord, there was a little bit of hanky-panky going on between the U.S. and the USSR, as I reveal in my dissertation, and the list of incidents we had post-1972 with the Soviets. But the public never saw this at the time because there was this classification called for U.S. USSR eyes only. And we would discuss these incidents privately with the Soviets at these annual meetings that we had every year, either in Moscow or in Washington. A difference of concern today is social media. Okay, in the 1980s, I recall an incident where I was the officer deck on board the Suribachi, and the Soviet destroyer pulled up alongside of us. It had its forward gun mount pointing at our bridge. This clearly was a violation of the Incidents at Sea Agreement, okay? But I'm thinking to myself, okay, is today the day World War III is going to start? Okay, is there any reason for this? And I'm there thinking, nah. And this guy obviously should be able to read that there's an E painted on the side of my ship because we're an ammunition ship. So any shot he shoots into us is going to take him out. Okay, so I decided just to politely ignore the fact that this guy was pointing his forward gun mount at me. Now, if this was today, somebody up on my signal bridge would have been taking a picture of that, would have been phoning that home to Papa back in Atlanta, and next thing you know, you're going to see it on CNN, Fox News. This is before the White House or the Kremlin would even have a whiff that this occurred, and it would be making the evening news cycle. That's a big concern I have today. The other challenge is there's differing interpretations of territorial seas. Growing up, I'm from New Jersey. I used to go down to Seaside Heights, and I'd sit on the beach as a little boy, and I could look out and see Russian fishing boats there because our territorial seas at the time, the United States claimed 3 nautical miles. And doing a little bit of research, it wasn't only until 1988 that we decided to go to 12. Okay, so that's pretty recent history. Now, one of the issues today, of course, is that with the creation of the 200-mile economic exclusion zone has been interpreted by some nations as an exclusion zone for non-economic activities, as evidenced by the air defense identification zones in East China Sea and South China Sea. So, thus, between social media and different views on territorial waters, I see the potential for the creation of artificial crises that could lead to some unfortunate crisis. And I'll leave it with there. I look forward to questions and comments.
Before I ask Michi for his comments, there are some seats here and there if you'd like to sit.
All right, thank you very much. Let me talk about 3 or 4 things. 1, Cold War successes. 2, Cold War challenges. 3, similarities and differences between then and now. And finally, Japan's future defense roles. First, Cold War successes. Some observers argue that Japan was a security free rider during the Cold War, but it is not true. In fact, Japan was making the biggest international security commitment in the 1980s in its history to date by playing a critical role of helping the United States execute the maritime strategy in the Pacific. Positioned in the center of the theater of confrontation between the US and the Soviet Union in the Pacific, Japan undertook two new important missions. One, blockading key choke point straits, Soya, Tsugaru, and Tsushima. Soya here, Tsushima here, Tsugaru here, and Tsushima here. And two, the defense of critical sea lines of communication, or SLOC. Objective of the strait blockade was to prevent Soviet naval forces from advancing from Vladivostok into the Western Pacific. The Maritime Self-Defense Force dramatically improved its anti-submarine warfare capabilities. The Air Self-Defense Force acquired C-130 transport aircraft as a mine-laying platform. The Ground Self-Defense Force introduced surface-to-ship missiles to attack Soviet surface vessels sailing through the straits. Objective of the SLOC defense was to make it possible for the US aircraft carrier battle groups to sail safely to the striking positions near Hokkaido. Hokkaido is this island here, northernmost island. The Maritime Self-Defense Force was tasked with anti-submarine operations and with providing safe passages in the Western Pacific for the US carrier battle groups. While taking up these new missions, the self-defense forces continued to provide protection over the US bases in Japan, such as the Air Force Base in Misawa, Yokota, Kadena, Navy bases in Misawa, Yokosuka, Atsugi, and Sasebo, and Marine air stations in Iwakuni and Futenma. Under the air defense provided by the self-defense forces, the U.S. forces could focus on offensive strike operations against the Soviet Far East. Japan's commitment to the U.S. global strategy did not result from political initiative, however. It was a result of the concerted effort made by the officials and officers of the Japan Defense Agency, the Self-Defense Forces, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the Ministry of Finance. Japanese political leaders were largely left out of the process, partly because of their lack of knowledge and interest in security matters. It was only when Yasuhiro Nakasone came into office in 1982 that the Japanese Prime Minister consciously endorsed his country's commitment to the global security strategy. This close US-Japan strategic cooperation produced good results. According to James Auer, a retired US Navy officer and a Japan specialist, no US Navy operator would doubt the importance of the US-Japan cooperation in executing the maritime strategy. It was, he said, unbelievable that, he said, we tracked every Soviet submarine by the end of the Cold War, unquote. Former Soviet Navy leaders agreed. One of the retired former Soviet Navy officers has acknowledged that the Soviets took a presence of allied navies, such as Japanese, in US military exercises very seriously. He even emphasized his respect for the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force. There were successes, there are challenges. During the Cold War, the US planners were concerned that Japan might become neutralized in case of war. The US government clearly indicated these concerns. Soviet military power, for example, the Soviet military power, this one, 1989, published by the US Department of Defense, stated that the Soviet military objectives in the Pacific included, I quote, neutralizing Japan and South Korea by military or political means to prevent them from supporting the US, unquote. Several related scenarios were looked into at the global war games conducted at the US Naval War College in the 1970s and 80s. In the 1979 game, the Soviet Union offered incentives to France, Israel, Japan, Pakistan, and Algeria to remain neutral. In the 1980 game, the Soviet Union detonated 3 nuclear weapons east of Japan to intimidate the Japanese government into neutrality. In the 1984 game, the Soviet Union perceived that it would be impossible to keep Japan neutral just with diplomatic pressure and military threat, and launched a large-scale air attack on Japan. The scenario in the 3-year serial games conducted between 1985 and 1987 was more interesting. In these games, Japan went back and forth between the US and the Soviet Union. During the first week of hostilities, the US conducted air operations with units based in Japan using Japanese bases against the Soviet Union. When Moscow protested that this was not in keeping with Japan's professed neutrality, the Japanese government condemned the US actions and banned the future use of Japanese soil as a base for US attacks on Soviet forces. But then Japan decided to take 2 damaged US aircraft carrier into the ports in Yokosuka and Osaka. It was certainly definitely not an offensive action, but Moscow again regarded this as a serious violation of neutrality and attacked Japan. Then the Japanese government finally made the decision to fully undertake alliance obligations and pledged to use its self-defense force to protect US forces in Japan. These are certainly hypothetical scenarios used for war games. Nevertheless, the repeated appearance of this theme clearly indicated the fact that the US planners took this issue seriously and examined how best to prevent Japan from getting neutralized, and if it did, how to fight the global war without Japan's participation. In fact, it is hardly surprising that the US planners were concerned about the neutralization of Japan. First, despite Japan's acquisition of modern military equipment such as F-15 fighters and P-3C patrol aircraft, it was doubtful that the self-defense force had real warfighting capabilities. Shortage of ammunition supply seriously limited the execution of realistic live-fire exercises. Many of the self-defense forces' air bases did not have aircraft shelters. There were no emergency laws defining the rights and privileges of the Japanese citizens and regulating military operations conducted by the self-defense forces in wartime. It was in 2003 and 2004, more than 10 years after the end of the Cold War, that the Japanese parliament enacted a set of legislation necessary for wartime operations. What are the similarities and differences between then and now? They are both good news and bad news when the current strategic environment in the Western Pacific is compared with that of the Cold War era. Good news first, during the Cold War, Kuril Island, offered the Soviet Union a useful natural barrier separating the Western Pacific from the Sea of Okhotsk bastion. Today, Japan controls these islands, the southwestern island or Ryukyu Island, and can use it as a natural defensive barrier. There are bad news, however. While the only exit Soviet fleets had for advancing to the Western Pacific were the 3 straits of Soya, Tsugaru, and Tsushima, today China's fleet have at least 9 to 10 locations that could be used to do the same because they are long island chain with a lot of gaps between them. China's economic performance is superior to the Soviets. The Soviet Union collapsed as a result of the arms race that it locked itself into with the US. The same might not happen between China on the one hand and the US and Japan on the other. According to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, Chinese defense expenditure grew by a remarkable 167% in the last decade, while the US-Japanese defense expenditure decreased by 0.4 and 3.7% respectively. Finally, Japan's future roles. Japan's defense roles in the future conflict in the Pacific will look very much like the ones during the Cold War. The Air Self-Defense Force will focus on air defense with a new emphasis on cruise missile and ballistic missile defense. US bases in Japan are becoming more vulnerable by day with a continued North Korean and Chinese missile force buildup. Planned introduction of F-35 fighters will help ease the mounting pressure. Though limited in number, F-2 fighter bombers can undertake strike operations against surface vessels. The Maritime Self-Defense Force will continue to provide safe slug sea lines of communication to US carrier battle groups operating in the Western Pacific with its anti-submarine warfare capabilities, which are one of the best in the world. Moreover, it will now protect US carrier battle groups from not only submarines, but also from anti-ship ballistic missiles that China is developing. The sea-based upper-tier SM-3 Block 1A ballistic missile interceptors will be upgraded to more advanced SM-3 Block 2A in the years to come. The ground self-defense force will might attempt to, I would say, stop hostile surface vessels at the strait along the southwestern island chain. It can deploy new Type 12 surface-to-ship missiles on the island chain like this, with a range of over 150 kilometers. They can cover all of the straits in the island chain. As the self-defense force will execute similar defense missions, Japan will face similar challenges. As the Soviet Union sought to neutralize Japan in case of conflict, North Korea and China will do the same. By now, North Korea has deployed more than 200 Nodon missiles capable of reaching Japan. With possibly miniaturized and usable nuclear devices at hand, North Korea can explode a nuclear bomb in Japan's vicinity in order to blackmail it into neutrality, as the hypothetical Soviet Union did in the global war game in 1980. China might attempt to neutralize Japan by taking the population in Okinawa hostage. Fear of entrapment remains very strong in Japan. According to the public opinion poll conducted by the Asahi Shimbun last year, while only 32% of the Japanese respondents thought that the new proactive security legislation enacted last year would strengthen deterrence. 64% of them answered that it would make it more likely that Japan might get entrapped in foreign wars. According to another poll, 70% of respondents disagreed with Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's comment that Japan would not get drawn into wars by the United States, even if the new security legislation was enacted. Keeping the isolationist Japan committed to global security will remain a challenge. Thank you very much.
We have a full house. We're also excited to have C-SPAN here with us today. There is a microphone. If you do have questions, please raise your hand and identify yourself. What I would like to do in the interest of time is actually take two or three questions together. So why don't we go initially with the gentleman here and then the gentleman in the red tie.
Thank you. Henry Hetker, researcher at NARA, a retired federal government. In the last couple of years, we've seen China fortifying this artificial island in the South China Sea. Many years ago, old Chinese theorists in military strategy indicated in war you must be clever. There's a limit to how much clever can be tolerated by the United Nations. In regard to this, I wondered what the current strategy will be or should be in regard to such an island that's built. Prior to World War II, Japan fortified all these islands that were mandated to them by the League of Nations. They were supposed to get their independence in time, but well, other mandates didn't work out too, other than the one that Japan had. And as such, it was a very powerful region that they had. It was sort of secretive. No other naval ships really entered their areas. They didn't need them present. And now we have a similar situation we're going to face in the South China Sea. What can and what should be done to develop a strategy to face this?
Hold that thought and then.
Hello, Steve Swingler, Office of Senator Dan Coates. The first part of my question is, how is the situation both similar and different with back then in the Cold War with the Americans and Japanese versus the Soviets, now with the situation with China? And then also today, would using carrier groups very offensively and very forward deployed like was supposedly done back in the Cold War, is that still viable, or might we have to move to something else, or do you have any thoughts on that topic? Thank you.
Okay, I guess regarding the question, what can we do about these artificial islands that are being created in the South China Sea? The one thing that our Navy and our government's made a commitment to is freedom of navigation operations. Freedom of navigation operations is, I guess it's been argued that we've been officially been doing these since 1979, but in reality, if you go back to your naval history, we've been going all the way back to the Barbary Wars against in Tripoli, establishing our right to freedom of the seas. Freedom of navigation operations, we conducted them in the against the Soviet Union. They claimed some waters that we didn't agree on. In fact, the one picture I showed you up on the bumping incident was the Karen in Yorktown being met by a Soviet frigate. This was in February 1988 in the Black Sea. And basically, we were demonstrating freedom of navigation. There is a rule in international law that if your peninsula juts out, you don't have to go around 12 miles around that to clear it. You can just cut through. And we were demonstrating that international right to do it, and the Soviets disagreed. Subsequently, there was meetings at Jackson Hole, and the Soviets came in line with the the correct interpretation that we're innocent passage is applicable in that case. We're going to be our understanding is that the United States Navy and we call on other navies of the world to continue to transit these waters that are close to these little island outposts that the Chinese are creating in the South China Sea. So I see that's going to be continuing on for the near and distant future. Peter, you have anything else?
Let me, a couple of points are important, especially, first of all, the gentleman from NARA. So in the period before World War II, given the nature of the world situation, technology, domestic policy, navies didn't normally operate hard by and off the coast of their designated enemies. During the period of War Plan Orange, when Ed Miller was writing about, the fleet practiced near Hawaii and near Panama. It didn't practice off Hokkaido or off off, 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 not immediately after World War II, they went back to the old way, but by 1947, 48, 49, it became pretty clear that based on the experience of World War II, based on the new technology, and based on the unfolding world situation, the thing to do with your fleet was to stick it right in the face of the enemy in time of peace to deter him from doing anything in time of war. And so they set up what became the Sixth Fleet in the Eastern Mediterranean, and they changed around what had continued to be the Seventh Fleet in the Western Pacific, and they did that extremely fortuitously because the carrier was in the Pacific when North Korea came south in 1950, and it showed the utility of having this combat credible forward presence. Obviously it didn't deter North Korea, but in this particular case it helped stop them. So ever since then, the convention has been for the US Navy to keep 2 forward battle fleets, sometimes 3, pretty stretched, things that David talked about. You need a lot of ships to be able to do this, off the coasts of wherever you're operating. Why is this important? Because in the South China Sea, we've been operating in the South China Sea since World War II, forward, always, and trundling back and forth and actually being there. We have a treaty ally in the South China Sea, Thailand and the Philippines, and it's the direct line to another treaty ally, depending on where you're going, to Japan, South Korea, Australia. It's also a line of communication to emerging friends, India and who knew, Vietnam. The presence of the fleet, the Seventh Fleet in the South China Sea, which has been continuous since 1950, is a difference between the kind of things you're talking about when Japan was fortifying islands out in the Pacific and no one went near them. We make a practice and have made a practice since World War II of going near those places that are of interest to us, even if they're 10,000 miles away. And parenthetically, that's one of the things that drives the large ships, the robust ships, the fully capable ships that we build, because they have to be able to go on out and stay out there for 6, 7, 8, 9 months in the kind of weather David was talking about to do their job. So that's a point. And that's different from, this is operations in international waters, different from the assertions of freedom of navigation, in which we assert certain things are international waters, which the local state does not, and then we do FONOPS. But in waters that are incontestably international, we operate. And we operate forward, and we have since then, and that seems to do the job both for presence, crises, and warfighting. The point about is having such a strategy, especially in time of war, viable given the increasing threats to things like aircraft carriers? There's a really superb article that just came out recently, which I would commend to you, by a guy named Michael Haas, H-A-A-S, and I think he did it in Defense One. It's on one of the blogs, and it just came out within the last week, in which he makes the point that the carriers have always been vulnerable. They're fighting ships. That's what they're for. When the Japanese carriers met American carriers off Coral Sea, when they met each other off Midway, the assumption was not that, my God, the Japanese might lose a carrier. The Americans might lose a carrier. We better back off. All during World War II, carriers fought carriers and other ships in the Western Pacific, because that's what warships do. This isn't pleasant. This isn't nice to think about. This isn't, but this is what fighting ships do. In the case of the Soviets, the period I discussed, they had, still have, backfire bombers that they overflew Dave. Having a backfire bomber overfly you, carrying these humongous Kelt missiles under them, really sobers you. As Dave said, you're always saying, is World War III going to start? Look at the size of that thing. But we had countermeasures, and we developed countermeasures for that. We developed equipment, like Aegis, which was mentioned, which Dave mentioned. We developed tactics, the outer air battle, which was an amazing ballet of F-14 fighters, Top Gun, Tom Cruise, all of that, right? And the kinds of radar-carrying planes that, like an Air Force AWACS, but Navy ones are the E-2s, the smaller ones, that can see out for thousands of miles and tell where everybody is and vector in the F-15s. where the tankers had to be to resupply those F-14s, both the Air Force tankers and Navy tankers, and where the electronic warfare airplanes had to be in order to jam the radars of the. All of those were worked out during the Cold War. The same with submarine tactics, the same with surface tactics. We're doing that. I'm not doing it. I haven't been in the Navy in over 20 years. The U.S. Navy is doing that today. Is that all going to work, and is that going to save the carrier in the next battle? You know, if the battle was tomorrow, the answer is yep. They're not going to touch us. If the answer is from 40 years, the answer is I don't know. And between now and then, many things can and will happen. But what the Navy thinks that that's what you pay it for, what it's supposed to do, is figure out ways to make sure that those carriers can stay forward, that the cruisers can stay forward, that the submarines can stay forward to do their job. Whether it's all going to work as wonderfully as I just laid out in the maritime strategy discussion, we don't know, but the Navy is certainly trying. And you just saw recently, for example, Secretary of Defense Carter mention offhand in a speech a missile that we had never publicly disclosed to anyone that we had. And there are other systems that we have that we've never publicly disclosed that we're working on, just as I'm sure you must suspect, the Russians and the Chinese and others are also working on systems. But the idea that somehow the carrier, wow, you know, they might hit it, and so we better back off and cede an entire ocean. That's not why you have the carrier. The carriers are built to stand and fight, and hopefully to win if we develop the right kind of systems to counter the enemy, which we're beavering away at as we speak.
Let me take the US-Japan question. Similarities and differences. I think the most important similarity is how we divide roles, because we continue to, the US continue to provide strike offensive capabilities, whereas we kind of take care of defense. Why do we do so? Partly because, I mean, that's what we had been, partly because the Japanese defense policy, which basically is not, we are not willing to possess offensive capabilities, which because it can be destabilizing. And because Japan was an aggressor in the Pacific War, so we are at least in the beginning, just after the end of the Pacific War, was not allowed to possess offensive capabilities, and this has continued. So we focus on air defense, anti-submarine warfare. You know, in case of mine warfare, we, you know, undertake both offensive and defensive mine warfare. But those things. And what's new after the end of the Cold War is the introduction of ballistic missile defense. But even that is we invest a lot of resources in ballistic missile defense, which is basically defensive-oriented capability. And also another reason why we focus on defense is that we are close to the source of threat. You know, we are close to the Soviet Union, we are close to North Korea, we are close to China. We have to defend, first of all, before we start thinking about strike capabilities. Differences, I think the two armed forces, US and Japan, are now much more closely integrated. So that's, I think, is one of the most important difference. And for example, in case of ballistic missile defense, we have now installed what's called the JADGE, Japan Air Defense Ground Environment, which is really basically US-Japan integrated intelligence sharing, target information sharing system, acquisition and sharing. And also, too, I think in terms of alliance management, the relationship has become a little bit more complicated because of the, namely, emergence of the Senkaku Island issue. Because before, during the Cold War, basically what Japan was worried about was, you know, in the 1980s, getting entrapped by the wars that the U.S. might fight with the Soviet Union, the global nuclear war. But we didn't really have to worry too much about abandonment because U.S. needed us. But now, we certainly sometimes, when Sino-U.S. relationships improves, we kind of start worrying about abandonment. And also, because U.S. and China are not in the Cold War, right? As in U.S. Soviet case. And also, Senkaku Island are just small islands. I mean, important for us, but not really don't have a really critical strategic importance. So it's more like a symbolic importance that they have. So now we are much more comfortable after President Obama said the United States would be willing to defend Senkaku as a part of a treaty obligation between the two countries, like 2 years ago. But Japanese planners are a little concerned about that. So, and also from the U.S. perspective, U.S. is now have to worry about entrapment by Japan in the war over the Senkaku Island. So you have to both. We have to worry about different things. And thirdly, and maybe finally, now Japan has a much stronger and political leadership, and which is interested in and is willing to undertake in a serious manner and think about and implement security policies. Mr. Abe is really leading this process of reforming Japanese defense policy. And so I think this is a good thing for Japan, because now this has really enhanced political accountability and democracy in my country.
I think we have time for 2 more quick questions. If we could get the gentleman here, then Tom. Oh, no, sorry.
Yes, thank you for coming. My name is Mitsuo Nakaya, member of the Reagan Foundation, Japan native, U.S. citizen. I have 2 questions. Number 1, regarding Northern Territory, if you know, can you comment on that? Because I understand that Japan and Russia are meeting in May. That's what I heard last week. So what is the possibility of talking about Northern Territory? Number 2, the Marine base in Okinawa, I heard they may be moving to Guam. Can you comment on that? What's going on? What's the progress on that one? Are they going to stay in Okinawa? Are they moving? Or I understand money is there to move for relocation. Thank you.
Let me say a word or two on the Senkaku. You might think that Chinese provocations in the vicinity of Senkaku Island is more serious than what the Soviet Union was doing. I don't think so. What the Soviet Union was doing was much more provocative in terms of the capabilities that they had and aggressive maneuvers that they were conducting in the vicinity in the face of our self-defense force assets both in the sea and also in the air and at sea. It was quite Soviet naval vessels frequently pointed the guns at our vessels easily, and we make a fuss now. Partly because, as David suggested, now this is an age of information age. We get the information very quickly and easily. We didn't know, the Japanese, at least the ordinary Japanese citizens know that on one day Soviet destroyer was pointing its gun at our vessel. We didn't know. So we kind of, all the things going, difficulties and the provocative action going on, we just turn blind eyes, all we could. Good news, bad news. We didn't. We are not informed bad news. We could kind of feel at peace. It was a good news, and so I'm not too concerned. And also, but also it is certainly little, in a way, little more difficult because we have to defend the Senkaku Islands. The northern territories, because the Russians occupied them, we didn't have to defend them. It was easy, you know. So, so that I think is good news that we maintain administrative control and, in my opinion, or even sovereignty over the islands. But bad news, we have to defend them.
Yeah, I'd like to make a comment. I attended a conference in Shanghai, I think it's about 5 years ago, on U.S., Japanese, Chinese trilateral maritime relations. And in reality, it's not a trilateral relationship. It was more like two bilateral relationships in that what I found, and this was right after we had the bumping incident with the Japanese Coast Guard and the Chinese fishing vessel. So we had Japanese scholars and Chinese scholars shouting their papers at each other. What we have is kind of like during World War II, China and the United States had a very close alliance vis-a-vis Japan. And during the Cold War, Japan and the United States had a very tight relationship vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, and in part, towards China, especially during the 50s and 60s and early 70s. So, I don't recall any situation where China and Japan were aligned against the United States. So we have this interesting dynamic. Now, as far as addressing how we deal with China, one of the things we need to do is continue to engage. We need to work with China as far as in talking. We've been working with them on the anti-piracy patrols in the Indian Ocean off of Somalia. We've been working with them on humanitarian assistance operations. They have a fabulous hospital ship. They've been a participant in annual RIMPAC exercises. So that's one way to kind of counter this concern that we're trying to do another containment, is to bring them into, the international community as a full partner. I think that's something we have to work hard at. Anything else, Peter?
Yeah, I think it in a sense, it's similar to the response that I had about the aircraft carrier. We've had 25 years, more or less, of non-Cold War and non-major hot wars against peer competitors, and we've slashed our defense structure, at least the United States has, Japan somewhat, the Europeans enormously, and we've gotten used to the fact that we can send naval forces around the world anywhere to do anything. And if you decide that you want to go bomb Libyans you don't like, or Iraqis you don't like, or somebody else you don't like, you just go ahead and do it, put together a coalition, and boom, all made it look easy. And we're forgetting what the Cold War was like. I just want to reiterate what Michi and Dave said. There were provocations every day at sea, and some of them were enormously dangerous. That's one of the reasons, or the main reason for the Ink Sea Agreement that Dave so brilliantly chronicled and reminds us of all the time. And every year the Japanese Navy does an exercise called Annual X. You would expect, if you're a Japanese taxpayer, that your Navy is keeping itself current and it does an exercise. And you would expect that if it has an ally, that it would invite the ally to join. And that happened increasingly during the 80s. 30, 40, 50 Soviet bombers flying over the exercise whenever the exercise occurred. Destroyers and fishing boats that weren't really fishing boats, and AGIs, which are intelligence gathering ships, following around each ship and each unit. That was routine. That wasn't some exciting thing that just happened that would make the newspapers, because that's how we operated. All of the exercises were conducted under the umbrella of Soviet anti-ship bombers and followed around by ships on the surface. Doesn't even account what happened on ships under the surface, famous incident off Japan one year in which one of the Soviet submarines was following too close and rose up right under the American aircraft carrier, which sliced it, and the crew of the carrier was all excited and painted a submarine on its island and said, you know, we're a sub-getting aircraft carrier. So that was ha-ha-ho, but that was, I mean, that could have resulted in serious loss of life. And all of those kinds of incidents took place, unfortunately, routinely. We got out of the habit of it wonderfully, and what's happening now is worrisome, most certainly, but really doesn't even compare to the kind of things that happened every day that caused people to sit around and hammer out the Inc.C. agreement that Dave has discussed. I want to answer the question about the Marines. I'm not an expert on this, so I'm not trying to be coy. I just simply don't know, but I'll tell you what I do know, which is vague. All right? So there are 3 divisions of Marines and 3 air wings of Marines, and the smallest of the 3 divisions and the smallest of the 3 air wings is located on Okinawa and has been since the mid-1950s. It is obviously forward positioned in a very advantageous place, so the American military likes it there and the Marine Corps likes it there. Meanwhile, Okinawa has changed. Okinawa is not this little remote island where a few people live and there's fishermen. And Okinawa is a big place with huge cities, and these cities have grown up around the bases which existed. This is the same thing that's happened all over the world, incidentally. It's happened on mainland Japan, it's happened in Oceania, it's happened in the United States, where a naval base or an Air Force base was put out in the woods in the 1920s, and now it's surrounded by a giant city. We have this at Oceania down in Norfolk. We have this near San Diego. So it's happened in Okinawa too. Okinawa people obviously don't like various aspects of this. Plus having all these 19-year-old Marines running around, dripping with testosterone, smashing into each other, and all doesn't appeal to them. So they want the Marines out. Okay, so Marines out, but wonderful place. So a compromise got hammered out several years ago in which, and I'm not going to be clear on this, but I think it's about half of the Marines that were currently in Okinawa at that time, whatever the number is now, we're going to leave and go to places like Guam and Saipan and rotate in and out of Darwin, Australia, and there were a number of options that were explored. And other Marines were going to remain in Okinawa, and the ones that remained, there was going to be some buying of land and exchanges of land, and they were going to put the aviation in a more remote part of the island and so on. But the Okinawans have never been happy with that agreement, and for that matter, I tell you honestly, the Marines haven't been all that happy with the agreement either, because Okinawa is in such a great location from their standpoint. And where's Senator Coates' office? The American Congress says, well, you're going to build facilities, are you? Well, I think that's great. I think if you were to build them in the sovereign state of Indiana, that'd be super. But you're not. You're gonna build them in Darwin and in Saipan and in Guam. We're not going to give you a dime to build anything in Guam. The Guamanian representative, who has no vote, incidentally, raises his hand and says, no, we'd be happy to have them here, but no vote. So it is a complex issue, and it is still in play. So recently, there have been some changes to this. And Abe just made a statement, which I don't want to paraphrase because I'm going to get it wrong. But this continues to cook. The Japanese government, central government, traditionally regards the Marines in Okinawa as an important part of the deterrent and an important contribution to the alliance, and they get it. Well, the Okinawan people get it too. They got a whole bunch of Marines living where they would rather the Marines didn't live. And this just continues. But these are discussions between allies, nobody's shooting at each other, and hopefully something will work out that will be satisfactory at least for a few years until they have to go renegotiate something else. I'm not being coy, that's about all I know about it. But something has recently just happened to perturb what they thought was an agreement over the last couple of years.
The mayor is being elected, and he is pro.
And by the way, the Senkaku Islands are the part of Okinawa. You have to remember that.
All right. I'm afraid the time has come for us to all go our separate ways. You may be questioning why our speakers did not question each other. There's a reason for that. They actually spent about 3 or 4 hours last week in a very small windowless room, hashing ideas out and preparing for this.
Now we are happy.
Now they have reached a peaceful conclusion to their talks. We will be summarizing the findings from that conversation. We hope to have that available online and in print within the next few weeks. Within the next few weeks. Those of you who are registered for this will automatically be getting a electronic version of that, so I do hope you will be able to read that and continue this conversation. I want to thank our three speakers for joining us today, and I really want to thank you all for being here today. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Peter, very
Good.
much.
Did that work?
Yeah.
Okay, good.